Right. The right of access to information, which by various international human rights tribunals in the last 15 years has been recognized as a fundamental right linked to freedom of expression. So when we're talking about transparency, about access to information measures, we're talking very much about the information which the public needs in order to be able to express, to form and express an opinion. This isn't just a sort of extra add-on, it's really core to one of the most fundamental rights, the right to freedom of expression, and that's been confirmed in 2011 by the UN Human Rights Committee, that access to information is part of Article 19 of the International Human Rights Instruments. We've seen in the context of that recognition, we've also seen a huge growth in the number of countries which have freedom of information or access to information laws. The creation of instruments, maybe we'll talk a little bit later about how those laws are used by investigative journalists, civil society, but we have the instruments now in around 135 countries. One of the questions then perhaps is, how well implemented are these laws, these instruments? And the answer is, in some ways, that we don't fully know. The UNESCO, which is the body charged under the Sustainable Development Goals with measuring the right of access to information, SDG 16.10.2, conducted in the last couple of years a survey of all the countries with access to information laws. And one of its major findings was that governments are not collecting the data. So we have a paucity of data on something that is a really important right that we've recognized is a right that's important for many things, one of them being the fight against corruption. So I guess the first challenge I would identify is we've made huge progress in recognizing the importance of this right. Challenge is we need much better measurement and evaluation of the levels of transparency. And that's where we have civil society organizations present, which are doing a lot of monitoring, both of the legal frameworks and of the actual levels of transparency in practice. Now, if we just dive in, I'll take one specific example then, just to conclude my first sort of 5-6 minutes introduction, and look at the UNGASS Political Declaration, which has in it language about committing to advancing with transparency, so general commitments, and there are, of course, a number of provisions in the, and references in the UNCAC itself, which refer to transparency explicitly or require transparency as part of implementing a particular measure. And that's repeated in general in the political declaration. And then we have something specific on, we have specific language on beneficial ownership. But when it comes to beneficial ownership registers, it's not 100% clear if the requirement is that this information be open to the public. Of course, the information should be open to law enforcement and other bodies, but we believe that it's very important that that information, also the beneficial ownership registers, as with company registers more generally, be open to the public. Why is that important? Well, first of all, it's important so that the information can be accessed by civil society organizations doing particular investigations, but it's also important because it's important to have the data checked, to know about the quality of the data. And given the shortage of resources that many government bodies have, having those extra eyes and the checking of the quality of data by a wider set of people, civil society is very valuable. What we've seen in the European region, where with the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive, there is a requirement, a concrete requirement, which came into force a couple of years ago in 2020, a concrete requirement that states create and have open to the public beneficial ownership registers. What we've seen is that for those countries that have implemented this, and not all of them have, even though they're over the deadline, so there's another challenge. Even when you've got hard legal requirements, complying with them is a challenge. But countries which have opened up their registers, the monitoring by civil society has identified many errors in them. For example, the Luxembourg Beneficial Ownership Register was scrutinized and significant numbers of errors were found in it. So it's having our data that exists, that's made transparent so that the public can use it for contributing to preventing corruption, rather than just prosecuting it after it's occurred, but also so that we can have, in a more collaborative sense, a recognition that transparency helps the collaborative effort to ensure that we have good data in the data that we need to combat corruption, but also the data that we need to progress on all the other sustainable development goals. So I'll stop there at first, but those are, for me, some of the most important. We are making progress, but we've still got a lot of work to do, is the overall conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. And I think we have time to go then a little bit deeper in the next round. Samantha, looking at the protection of whistleblowers, what are you have done research looking into all the laws, all the data you've been able to get your hands on. What are your, so to say, conclusions of the status so far?
Thanks, Matthias. Do I have to?
No.
Okay. Everyone can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank the European Union for sponsoring today's event and for the UNCAC Coalition for organizing this chat, and also thank everyone for attending today. I think much like what Helen said, the same is true for whistleblower protection, where there has been a lot of progress in this regard, but there's still a lot more to be done. A study by the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners showed that 50% of fraud is detected by whistleblowers, and actually losses from fraud are 50% less for corporations that have a hotline available for whistleblowers. And there's also a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers that shows that whistleblowers are responsible for exposing and catching more fraud than if you combine audits, compliance departments, and law enforcement together. So they're really a powerful tool for fraud prevention. And so it really goes hand in hand, whistleblowers and fraud prevention. You can't have one without the other. Now, we're seeing around the world, especially I think during the pandemic, that as whistleblowers are exposing corruption, they're facing retaliation. Whistleblowers are being harassed, arrested, physically attacked, and sometimes even killed. They may no longer be able to work in their job. They may lose their reputation, and the financial costs can be really great. And this has a chilling effect on other whistleblowers who would be reporting corruption, but they're seeing other people doing it, and they're maybe reconsidering whether or not that's the path that they want to take. So one of the problems that we've seen in this kind of emergency situation of the pandemic is that too few countries have whistleblower laws in place. The Article 33 of the UNCAC says that the member states shall consider incorporating whistleblower protection law into their legal system, but it's not a very clear commitment to do so. So if you look at the number of parties to the UNCAC who have whistleblower frameworks in place, the ones that have comprehensive laws is just over 20%. And if you're looking at combining countries that have a more narrower sectoral whistleblower law, it's a bit over 30%. So there's a lot more to do. The European Union passed a whistleblower directive that required member states to transpose it by the end of last year, and the member states are still catching up and trying to transpose the EU directive. So we are seeing certainly, I think, a trend where there's more whistleblower laws being passed, and I think that's a really strong step, certainly in the right direction. However, according to a study by the Government Accountability Project and the International Bar Association, the whistleblower laws, where they exist, are failing to protect whistleblowers in reality. If you're combining all of the whistleblower retaliation cases of all of the countries that we studied, about only 20% of whistleblowers prevailed when they brought a retaliation case. And the overwhelming majority of countries that we studied really weren't implementing their whistleblower laws at all. We found that 89% of countries in our study had fewer than 15 reported whistleblower retaliation cases, and 60% had no reported decisions in whistleblower cases at all. So there's a lot more that we need to do beyond just passing paper rights. We need to make sure that there's appropriations that are being provided to establish the systems to support the law, and to make sure that people are also educated about the law's existence so that they can use these frameworks. Now we've seen in this time of Pandora papers and pandemics how important whistleblowers are. So we really think that it's important for the next Conference of State Parties to have a dedicated resolution that will elaborate on specific measures that can be implemented to really actualize the intentions that are behind protecting people who are reporting corruption. And so there's kind of 6 key things that we recommend. And the first is that it's really important for nations, of course, to start enacting paper rights. However, there is more that can be done while you're waiting for national legislation through agency level policies that can, they don't have to wait, they can provide some protection for whistleblowers. Second is that it's really important to have the provided funding to implement whistleblower laws and to make sure that the infrastructure is there and that people are trained on how to understand, interpret, and implement the whistleblower law. And to make sure that those channels are established before people are trying to utilize the law. The third is that it's only after these first 2 steps occur that the public should be educated about their rights and to start using the reporting channels. Because if you advertise that you have a hotline or reporting channel and you don't have strong legal protection in place first to protect them from retaliation, it's like leading the lamb to the slaughterhouse. Fourth is that the private sector has a lot that they can do to protect whistleblowers and to provide reporting channels. Studies repeatedly confirmed that between 90 to 90% of whistleblowers report internally to their employer first. And it's really only when an organization is knowingly participating in corruption, when there's bad faith, that it's necessary for a whistleblower to go externally. So these internal channels are a very important part of whistleblower protection. Fifth, is that it's really important to have transparency and to have proactive public reporting about how are these corruption investigations being implemented and how are these whistleblower cases being decided so that we can learn from our failures and from our successes. One, for instance, key question mark we have is how many whistleblowers are getting relief through settlement agreements. They can get much faster, much more affordable relief through settlement agreements, but there's no proactive public reporting on how many whistleblowers are actually, in essence, winning. And then we think that's a win-win for the whistleblowers and for the employers to be resolving these disputes amicably between the parties. And finally, we think that civil society has an important role to play in supporting member states to reach these goals. And so, we've seen really that there's a shared understanding and shared acceptance among the UNCAC parties that it's that whistleblowers play this important role. And I think that shows that whistleblowers are winning the cultural revolution. And that in and of itself is a really big step in the right direction. So now it's important to take things to the next step. And hopefully at the next Conference of State Parties, there can be a dedicated resolution to whistleblowers so that we can have more actionable commitments to follow through on that understanding that whistleblowers are important, because we're not yet seeing enough happening in that regard. And I think that, before there's the next pandemic, before there's the next papers, we want to make sure that we're not silencing our early warning system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samantha. Before I hand over to David for his intervention, I would encourage you to think about any questions you have to these experts. Those of you in the room and also online, if you're online, please use the chat to pose your questions or comments, and we will try to get back to you. But David, I'm happy to hand over to you.
Thank you, Matthias, and good afternoon, everyone. I wish I could be there in Vienna with you today, but instead I'm in semi-sunny London instead. I'm going to step back a little and talk about some of the broader trends affecting civil society, whether it's the FOI activists, the whistleblowers, the journalists, and so on, and how their fight against corruption is being affected. I don't think I need to lecture anyone on the state of the world these days, but just VDEM, which is the Swedish academic network, Varieties of Democracy report from 2022, said that the level of democracy is down to 1989 levels. So we've seen 30 years of movements towards democracy eradicated in just the last 10, basically. And related to what we're talking about is, a record number of 35 countries just in the last year had significant deteriorations in freedom of expression. So it's down now to quite low levels. My own old organization, Article 19's Global Expression Report this year found that only 15% of the world's population live in countries where they can seek, receive, or share information freely and safely, and 35% live in countries in crisis. So that really does fundamentally affect the ability of civil society, of journalists, of whistleblowers, and of everyone else who's fighting against corruption to be able to freely work and do what it is that needs to be done. So going back to UNGASS just last year, though it seems a lot longer ago now, it really was a accumulation of a lot of work over the years to try and raise some of these issues. And the resolution itself, and especially in Article 31, has some strong commitments for the first time in the anti-corruption UNCAC process around protection of journalists, around protection of civil society, and so on. So it was, very good to see those adopted in there, and to see some, flesh put into the details that are set out in Article 13 of the convention itself about public participation. But obviously there is a lot still to be done on that. The UN Special Rapporteur this year on human rights defenders, Mary Lawler, issued a report on anti-corruption and human rights defenders, where she very broadly looked at the issue of the challenges that human rights defenders were facing and what states and others should do about it. She found that uncovering corruption was, quote, considered to be a dangerous field for activists across all issues, and that they face severe risks for doing so. This is the UN Special Rapporteur saying this. So clearly there's a lot of problems. The Committee for Protection of Journalists has found that almost 300 journalists have been killed in the last 20 years for corruption-related investigations. 92 are currently in jail for the same issues. Countless more have been attacked, threatened, kidnapped, surveilled, fired, faced unjustifiable legal attacks, slap suits, by powerful individuals, especially those attached to governments, who use the legal system in an abusive way to prevent people from speaking out. On the civic space side of things, more broadly, Civicus has found that now 89% of the world's population lives in countries with significant restrictions on civic space, and 3% lives in countries which are rated as open. So it is a fairly grim situation out there. Positive trends. Well, those are a little bit harder to find. The Special Rapporteur's report was quite important because it was the first time ever that the UN has looked into this nexus of corruption, human rights abuses, and defenders, and come up with something quite tangible about it. There is some reasonable progress around the issue of SLAPP suits, with the European Union looking at possibly doing a directive on that. The Council of Europe working on it becoming a political issue in a reasonable number of places, such as it can be, especially here where I'm sitting, where we're the SLAPP center of the universe, apparently. And as Samantha said, the growth of whistleblower laws. I mean, the EU directive, and Vienna has its spirit of Vienna. Brussels has the Brussels effect, which is when they adopt something, countries around the world follow suit and use their work as a model. So the Brussels effect on whistleblowing will hopefully result in a lot of countries adopting decent whistleblower laws with mechanisms to make them work. I have a couple of, let's say, simple recommendations. Very easy to do, no problem. First, a couple for UNODC. I think following the UNGASS Declaration and what's in the UNCAC already, as well as the university module that they've already put out, some actual guidelines on public participation would be quite helpful for states. Obviously, a resolution at the next COSP would be even better, if possible. Second is creating an independent mechanism for rapidly responding to attacks on anti-corruption officials, NGOs, journalists, whistleblowers, and others. The UN Environmental Program set one up a couple of years ago. So I think it's time for those fighting against corruption to get that same level of protection. Similarly, at the state level, there's a lot of states that have adopted protection mechanisms for human rights defenders. Those mechanisms need to be specifically incorporating anti-corruption in their protection mechanisms, as well as journalists if they don't already protect them. And then finally, states should repeal those abusive laws, criminal libel, adopt anti-SLAPP protections and so on, so that people are able to actually effectively fight against corruption from the civil society and journalists and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We've already gotten quite a bit into depth of what we would possibly like to see states doing. Helen, do you have also thoughts on what role can a mechanism like the UNCAC or follow-up to the UNGASS play in advancing transparency and access to information? Are there specific things that you would highlight, or would you have, so to say, priority actions for states that you would like to highlight?
Well, just to sort of kick this off, I'd love to see if we've got any questions from the audience as well, but in response to that, I'd identify two things. One, as we've already indicated, we've got certain measures which are not yet being implemented. And Dave talked quite rightly about the Brussels effect. We've seen it, for example, with data protection. But until we have all, and this is a message turning from the EU here, until we have all states in the EU implementing their beneficial ownership registers and making them open, and implementing the whistleblower regulation and making sure that it actually works in practice, we're slightly undermining the Brussels effect. So I think leading by good practice, to the extent that you're a country that should be doing that and can do that, doesn't have to be a country that's bound to do these things under a particular directive. I think we're very clear, and we don't have time this afternoon to talk about the detailed standards that we have, but be it on access to information laws, proactive publication, a series of corruption prevention measures, assets declarations, conflicts of interest, lobby regulation. We have, between civil society and mapping of the better legal frameworks and practices in different countries, we've got great clarity on what the standards are. If anyone's not sure what to do, just come and talk to us at the UNCAC Coalition, and we can give you a pile of homework to read. I think we know what we should be doing. It's a question of generating the political will to do it. Perhaps that's the harder bit than knowing what the standards are. And the same goes specifically in my area of specific expertise, access to information laws. We have very clearly identified everything that an access to information law should contain. And if you look at the UNESCO survey that I mentioned earlier, one of the other interesting findings, apart from the lack of data, was that to the extent that we do have data, countries which have an independent oversight body, such as an information commission or commissioner, which is actually overseeing the implementation of access to information laws, and I think that goes for other mechanisms. You need an independent body that's actually charged with making sure it works in practice, with the training of public officials, that kind of thing. If you have those independent bodies, then the resulting implementation is significantly and measurably better. So I think that that's another recommendation.
Thank you, Helen. Samantha, you already highlighted some of the recommendations you have for a possible COSP resolution and for states, but would you like to highlight any other aspects of how could we build further momentum or keep the momentum we have now going, and you know, what could we do at the COSP to make sure we make progress and or continue the progress we're on?
I think Helen touched upon, I think the most essential points, and I just maybe want to reiterate that I think that civil society does play a really important role, and so government accountability projects and Access Info and members of the UNCAC Coalition are here as experts to support member states. The Whistleblowing International Network, which Government Accountability Project is a founding member of, was very involved in working with the European Commission on the EU Whistleblower Protection Directive. And we really helped to get it to a place where it was something that is now kind of the leading best practice standards for what should be in a whistleblower protection law. Another two success stories I might share would be Serbia and Ukraine, where civil society worked really closely with Serbia and with the government of Ukraine on the whistleblower laws. And they were very consultative, not just with civil society, but with law firms, experts, other countries. It was an international collective effort. The United States provided technical assistance and support in that regard. And those are two countries that have some of the strongest whistleblower laws today. In Serbia, it has one of the highest success rates of whistleblowers in their retaliation cases. So I think this sort of multilateral assistance ends up being a really important part of the success story. And I think that the political will is certainly, as you can hear, I think during the meetings today, just how much the political will is growing in strength. And so now I think it really is time for this level of action items and commitments to really taking it a step further and committing to something that can be measured with specificity about how we're going to take whistleblower protections to the next level.
Thank you, Samantha. And before I go to the room for any questions, David, do you want to add something? How can we build more momentum on the global level? And you being very well aware, or we all of here being aware that we're operating in a consensus environment. How can we get states to push forward, or at least states that are willing to make progress? How can we use a global forum to keep any momentum going, even though, as you have highlighted, there may have been more backlashes in many areas than momentum?
Well, not necessarily in Vienna, but I mean, there are forums where this kind of progress is encouraged. So the Open Government Partnership is a place where there's coalitions of the willing who can come together and make the commitments that we had hoped to see out of UNGASS, but didn't really see so much. And then there's the Summit of Democracy that's happening again this year, I believe, in the US. which will also, is for the next year is encouraging commitments and progress on those sorts of things. So I think using those kinds of mechanisms to build momentum can be very useful towards then coming back and trying to do something tangible at the next COSP and in other UNCAC fora also.
Thank you very much, Dave. Are there any questions or comments or reactions in the room? Yes, please. And please also introduce yourself briefly. Thank you.
So hello everyone, this is Ayarihi, a board member of the UNCAC Coalition representing iWatch organization on the MENA seat. I would like to thank you for your interventions. I have just a comment. Actually, there is thank you for highlighting the idea of human rights defenders. So because on the last CPI, the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, the relationship between human rights and democracies and the fight against corruption is very, very close. Like out of 331 recorded cases of murdered human rights defenders in 2020, 98% occurred in countries where CPI score is below 45. And this shows that actually when it's not a democracy, when human rights are granted, and when checks and balances are not actually assured, the anti-corruption become a whim of the persons in power, and this happens a lot. They use anti-corruption cases for political reasons, which make people more and more afraid to report, afraid from the political use of their cases, even if it's the right cause and the right thing to do. So this is the comment I want to say, but my question is, what are the things that we can do regarding the justice? Because impunity is the one thing encouraging everyone to continue in the corruption they're doing. So,
thank you very much. I will see if there's other questions. Any other comments or questions in the room? Yes, please.
My name is Mukhtar Ahmed Ali. I am from Pakistan. I work with a civil society organization where we have been working on right to information for quite some time. And we have made some progress in terms of right to information laws. We have reasonably good laws in at least 2-3 provinces and at the federal level. But my feeling is that after having been working on this issue for quite some time, that whether it is making really an impact, and whether this effort has really been worthwhile, and whether this was the right path to fix this problem. Because you see, there is an overall government culture. And there are many reasons which contribute to the incidence of this problem. And those problems which actually cause corruption have remained unaffected. They're still there. Now, by using right to information laws, we are sometimes able to draw attention to this problem or that problem. But the overall organizational culture and the government culture is so powerful that we are unable to demonstrate impact. So the basic reasons which contribute to the problem of corruption remain there. For instance, one major issue is in our countries like ours, how we define corruption. The different types of corruptions, for instance, which would go away if we reform our systems and procedures. Speed money, for instance. There may be an officer who works for just 8 hours and go home. He is honest officer, but is not willing to more than what is expected of him. And there is another who sits there for 12 hours and charges the speed money. With a little bit of reform in the system and through proper incentives, this will go away. but there's hardly any effort in countries like ours, which is being made into reforming the systems. Now, we also have been arguing that, look, through right to information laws, we can dig out data, and, with that evidence, we can make a case and all that, and that would put pressure on the system. Well, I mean, all right, this may work over the long period of time, but I think simultaneously there's need to probably pay attention to those kinds of problems which actually cause it, And now we also face stumbling blocks. For instance, they would say, I also worked in the commission for 3 years, and they would say, look, we have lost the record. So then you have, ended up, there's nothing you can do. And the record keeping conditions are so bad. I mean, in a country like ours, I mean, I'm not just talking about Pakistan. I think there are many other developing countries. So my question is, and actually that, how actually we can focus our attentions to the real problems in governance, which if addressed, maybe, because you see the two extremes, there are cultures where integrity is a norm maybe and corruption is the exception. And there are countries where corruption is the norm and integrity is an exception. Now, in this second type of countries, where can right to information can really be a magic bullet which can fix it?
Thank you very much for that challenging observation. We have one more question from the online chat, which is maybe Helen and David are best placed. The question is, what is the United Nations doing? How are they working with regional blocks of countries or other organizations to promote access to information? Maybe you have a thought on the role of the United Nations in that regard, but that's usually less UNODC, I think, and maybe other UN bodies that are more involved there. Yeah, do you want to?
I'll have a go, Mukhtar. Thank you for your question. With respect to what the UN's doing, as I already mentioned, the body that's actually charged with SDG indicator 16.10.2 is UNESCO. The indicator is the right that all states have a right of access to information law and that it's implemented. So that's the body that's doing something. UNESCO doesn't have huge resources to do this, but they are trying to evaluate levels of compliance, look at the quality of the laws on paper, which is easier to measure. It was interesting you mentioned Serbia earlier, for example. Serbia does have a strong access to information law, has significant problems, but we can see how that access to information law, which is strong with an independent oversight body, has helped people who are trying to stop corruption being even worse than it might be otherwise, because we don't know what the alternatives are always. We know that the Austria, if I can name check Austria right now, has, according to our evaluation, pretty much the weakest access to information law in the world. And I would barely call it an access to information law, given you've got official secrecy in your constitution. So there's something to work on. So I think that we know what some of the things are. It's not good enough just to have a law that's called an access to information law, or only to have it on paper. That's absolutely clear. Maybe we were a little bit naive. I'm not saying that I've been naive, but I've had this conversation. You mentioned the words magic bullet at the end. Transparency is not a magic bullet that's going to solve the problems of corruption. And you yourself said, in fact, that we need a whole series of structural reforms. You mentioned the word culture earlier, political will, but it is something that is incredibly useful. I would say it's necessary, but not sufficient to combat corruption. The other thing is the mere fact that you've got an access to information law in place with some requests for information being answered and some information being published on government websites doesn't necessarily mean that the information that we need in order to combat corruption as it evolves and escapes our controls is the right information. And I'll come back to the example of opening up company registers and beneficial ownership registers. We still have, we have the good examples. We can say Ukraine or the UK or Colombia has opened up their company registers. But if that's if we can count the number of countries that have got a really good example on the fingers of one or two hands, then we're not making good enough progress. So the transparency mechanisms that we need, corruption is a complex international phenomenon. We need to ensure that country by country, the data is open so that be they law enforcement, official law enforcement bodies, or investigative journalists can actually track the illegal flows of money transnationally, and we don't have those systems in place yet. So if we zoom out a bit and look at our global systems, they're just not good enough yet to permit us to get a full picture of what's going on and to identify what the problems are. I do think, however, that be it via leaks or be it via investigations of NGOs and investigative journalists, we can point to many instances where information has come to light, which has revealed corruption, and we're going to be talking a lot in the coming days about asset recovery, where assets are being recovered. So it's not good enough. It's not satisfying. It's frustrating. It's too slow. But I think that we know what we have to be doing. We just have to be doing it a little bit better. Let's see if I just have one more tiny point on that. I think that that's it, really. The same with lobby regulation in the European region. We've got very few countries which have lobby registers and transparency of lobbying. So once again, I actually think that we're kidding ourselves if we can say, oh, transparency check, done that. We haven't. We've identified what we need to do. We started to make progress towards it. We need to work together a lot more, and together is the key word. Just to finish, Matthias, sorry, on this answer. The collaboration between civil society, Dave mentioned the Open Government Partnership. That's a really interesting initiative for those of you who don't know about it. I'm just coming to the end of my term on the Global Steering Committee. And there are 11 civil society organizations and 11 governments on the Global Steering Committee of the Open Government Partnership. So that is genuine collaboration between civil society and governments on trying to advance with transparency, accountability, and participation. I think we need much closer collaborations. We need to keep civic space open within the UNCAC processes. We need to ensure that we strengthen civic space and collaboration between anti-corruption bodies and civil society at the national level, so that we can all work together to solve these significant challenges which have been pointed out. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Samantha, what are your thoughts and reactions to the questions?
So I think, these are the big questions that are being asked, but I actually think my comments on the first and the second question are interrelated. The first being about justice and accountability, and the second about, what can we focus on the real problems in governance and talking about addressing the root causes of corruption. I think one of the problems that we have is when we are enforcing the laws against corruption and basically punishing a wrongdoer, does that punishment fit the crime? If you're a very rich and powerful corporation, for instance, like Boeing, when they had the MRAPs, I think is what they're called, and they were causing these plane crashes, there was this gigantic settlement, but there was inadequate action to actually address the corporate culture at the corporation and to really fire all of the people at the top. And those financial penalties for a company of that size, it's very difficult to punish them in a way that would have a deterring effect to commit these offenses again. And there's reason to believe that after this settlement with Boeing, that the culture hasn't changed, and there's still a culture of retaliation against whistleblowers and silencing the messenger. And so, when planes are crashing and our very lives are in their hands, we have a vested interest in corporate accountability and safety. And so, I asked the question, even when there could be millions of dollars of a settlement for a crime of corruption, is that enough? Is that having a deterrent effect? You actually see some enforcement actions against companies repeatedly. So clearly, in cases like that, there may not be a deterrent effect. I also want to add that the United States Federal Trade Commission, for example, which enforces the antitrust laws, and if you think about, maybe Twitter going private, maybe with Elon Musk or not, but if it's no longer, publicly traded company, then it would be under the FTC's jurisdiction to enforce antitrust laws, and they don't have the power to enforce civil penalties for violations. So there's the first offense would basically be a determination and a letter, and then the second offense may have some very small civil penalty, which would be inadequate to address antitrust violations at a company like Twitter. And so I think we have a fundamental problem, and this is to just demonstrate the complexities behind law and enforcement. But I think until there is accountability that has enough of a preventative measure to deter corruption from happening in the first place, and let alone happening a second time, then we are going to continue to be in this fundamental place of companies thinking they can get away with it. Because when we're looking at these studies, what are we seeing? As David mentioned, SLAPP suits. SLAPP suits allow companies to bury whistleblowers, and the lack of success that whistleblowers are having in whistleblower protection laws means it's very easy for companies to win. But the problem is, even when they lose, they're winning because the financial consequences are so small. The relief that whistleblowers get when they win their cases is so minuscule, and it would not be enough to have a deterrent effect, let alone actually making the whistleblower whole. So behavior can't be expected to change unless we have a very serious look at crime and punishment, and I would perhaps argue that that would be the key area to be looking at if we're talking about prevention. But it's a very complex problem, of course, and there's no one, I think, magic solution to that. So, good questions.
Thank you, Samantha. David, what are your reactions to the questions posed?
Well, a couple. One, on the UN level, it should be mentioned that the Office of High Commission for Human Rights came out with a report this year on the standards that states should adopt on access to information law. So that's a much more detailed analysis of what they had done before under General Comment 34. So it's something quite a model that states could follow, should follow, issued by the UN itself. So it's something beyond what we as civil society have been releasing for years as our model laws and our principles and so on. So that was a positive thing in the last year. On the issue of whether we oversold FOI laws as solving all problems, well, maybe we did a little. No, I'm not saying you, Helen. No, and not me either, because I'm too cynical to do such things. But somebody might have somewhere hypothetically said that whistleblower or FOI laws will solve all problems. Do we believe that it will? No. I mean, we know that there is a whole variety of different issues, and corruption is inherently difficult to address in any circumstance, and very few countries have said that they have fundamentally changed things based on that. It's an evolutionary process. If you look at the US, which at least on the federal level is fairly uncorrupt by most assessments, it took over 100 years of different legislation just piled on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other. And FOI wasn't even the most recent on that. Whistleblowing came along after FOI. Asset disclosures of public officials came on after that. Lobbying disclosures came after that. There are just so many things out there that need to be addressed. And of course, FOI is not just about anti-corruption too. It's about accountability and governance on a variety of issues. So whether it's environmental protection or public safety or any number of other things. So I apologize if the message was heard that FOI was going to save everything, but I'm declining to accept responsibility for it also. And then finally, on the issue of deterrence that Samantha mentioned, I think it's interesting that the EU learned some lessons from some laws that they had adopted in the past on data protection and other things. And now, if a company has been really quite egregious, they can be fined up to 4% of their entire international income. So that could be tens of billions of dollars. And they've recently upgraded that with the Digital Services Act and the GDPR. So that is becoming kind of a standard among EU legislation now to have the power to issue substantially deterrent fines, as opposed to, oh, here's a couple of million, which is your lunch money for a couple of days, or your Learjet fuel for a couple of days, to something which will have an impact on the corporate bottom line.
Thank you, Dave. So we have 3 more minutes. Are there any other questions or comments in the room? Yeah, there's.
I was just interested in the idea that Dave mentioned about a resolution or looking towards guidance on how in the framework of the UNCAC we build better multi-stakeholder, so including civil society, but I don't think it's only civil society. I think it's important to remember, some of our projects at Open Contracting Partnership involve like HIV positive patient organizations, right? So we can think a bit broader here about like the people who are actually on the receiving end of corruption. So I'd just be interested to hear a bit more from Dave or you, Matthias, actually on what we might do as a coalition on proposing some of that stuff and what we would like to have improved.
Could I just say one clarification there? Hi. When I talk about civil society, I'm using it as a broad term for all stakeholders, not only the specialist anti-corruption organizations, but absolutely be it your HIV positive patients organization or your effect. And I would actually include business and SMEs particularly in that, who are often excluded from the market because of corruption. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, from our perspective as the UNCAC Coalition, I think we're trying our best to break down some of the silos, even within the treaty bodies here in Vienna, so that we work with civil society groups that work on organized crime, that we work with civil society organizations that work on environmental issues, on climate change, that we really bring the stakeholders together, because we often lack the issue-specific expertise. They lack the expertise on anti-corruption and transparency measures. And I think that's something we have to pursue, that we build wider, broader coalitions. And so I think your example of also bringing in the groups that are really the victims of corruption and of a lack of accountability, that's a really important point to widen the inclusivity of the UNCAC and all the discussions we're having. That's a truly important point. David, because Kristen also mentioned you, did you want to react to that as well?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say there are some places where there is some good practice on this. Not necessarily here, but in many places, the OGP national networks work pretty well as multi-stakeholder initiatives where governments and civil society and companies in some cases come together to come up with agreements on what the action plan should be and move forward on those. Here we have a UK anti-corruption broad-based civil society group, which meets with a sort of parallel government group called the Joint Anti-Corruption Unit, JACU, in the UK, and that's not a bad model. We have a sort of regular engagement with them. I wouldn't say we come to a consensus on things, but at least we have that engagement. Yeah, really sort of the sort of broad-based thing, which isn't so much popular these days with a lot of governments, of actually engaging with the broad coalitions is the place to start.
Thank you, Dave. And I think engagement is an important point. So if any of you have questions, would like to discuss topics in more detail, please take advantage of the presence of Samantha, of Helen, and of other colleagues from civil society. We would be happy to talk confidentially and off the records and give you inputs, suggestions, or link you to other civil society experts who may be able to discuss the topic further with you. So on that note, really appreciate you all joining us during the lunch break. Thank you very much for your attention, for joining us, for the questions. And as I said, we're available. Have a nice day, and join us also if you're here tomorrow. We will have a side event sponsored by the United States on progress in asset recovery, another important topic of this intersessional. So please join us, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Matthias, for chairing.
Thank you very much, Dave.
Just like 1 minute too, and there's nobody. I thought that was, oh my goodness. They're very punctual, these guys. I mean, me too, totally.